Every day, it seems, we are witness to how LGBTQ rights are being tested as never before. A wave of legislation is sought to regulate such things as who can play in school sports, what books are allowed in the classroom, what kind of health care can and cannot be provided to transgender children, and the list goes on. On the front lines of this debate are Wendy Strout, Human Rights Campaign's Wisconsin Director, Melinda Brennan, the ACLU's Wisconsin Executive Director, and Jessica Katzenmeyer, a former Wisconsin State Senate candidate. All are here to take stock of the human toll and the superheated culture wars that are shaping many of your beats at the Statehouse. So join me in welcoming them here today, and as always, come with your questions.
Thank you for having us, first off. So I ran for state senate in 2022. My district is in the western suburbs of Milwaukee. Is one of the highly contentious state senate races in the state, being a partisan rating. It was a D+1 district, so I was a Democrat challenging an open seat in that race. It was probably one of the most watched races in the state senate for statehouses, arguably across the country as well too. So we did get a lot of media coverage in this race, and me being an out transgender woman, I was the first one ever here in Wisconsin to run for state senate. I had a primary opponent in that race. I was the first to win a contested state senate primary, beat Tom Hauswich by nearly 10 points in that primary, when just because of being trans, and I feel like a lot of the odds were against me in that primary, and a lot of people didn't give me a chance to win, but I used that as motivation for my team and I. We worked really hard in that race. We won the primary, and I was a nominee for the Senate district. And other dynamics that was at play is, at the time, Republicans were a net gain of 1 seat away of having a supermajority in the state Senate. So there was a lot at stake. Talk about having the pressure on me. For the most part, media coverage in my race, it was pretty good. I had a lot of positive media coverage. And my approach to it was I like to keep good relations with the media people I was working with, because I always felt if I kept those good relations, I was always going to get a good story coming back to me too. And that's what we wanted to bring about in our campaign. I wanted to have that positive atmosphere. I wanted people to look at me as I was the #1 candidate to vote for, to do the job, instead of looking at me, oh, she's transgender. Yeah, my identity is really important to me, but I wanted people to look at me as the person that's going for this job, the state senate. It's very exhausting being a transgender person in a state like Wisconsin. It's a very purple state where elections can really decide one way or another how the state goes in terms of transgender rights, LGBTQ rights. I mean, we've seen what's happened in Florida, we've seen what's happened in Texas and Tennessee, and things are threatening to happen right now as well too. As an out transgender woman, I honestly don't feel comfortable traveling to Florida right now. And that's because of a lot of the laws that have been introduced there and have been passed and signed by the governor there. For example, there's been cases of, because of the anti-drag show ban that they had that was passed there, there's been transgender people who have been arrested just for walking around wearing daily clothes like I'm wearing today, just being who I am. And it really shouldn't be that way. This is a country that we base a lot of our stuff on freedoms and rights, and we're just living as who we are as people and doing what makes us happy. And that's why it's exhausting. I feel like it's constantly fighting for our own existence. Every election cycle, it's like that. It's like, and then when the right people do get elected or reelected, then it's like you breathe that sigh of relief, and then we got to get ready for the next fight, and then the next fight, and then, what's coming up next? in terms of the campaign, I did have to put up with a lot of transphobic hate. I love my staff. My staff that worked for me, they were amazing people, a lot of younger people that did a lot of amazing things with technology that we had to use to get my message out there, but they also had to take in a lot of those incoming messages, like the hate messages that I had to put up with, and I feel for them that they had to read some of that. And it's crazy to think that people are so comfortable writing a message like that, yet they won't say that to my face. I just learned just to keep pressing forward, battle through it every single day. I try not to let it bother me. I thought in my head, hey, these are the people with the issues, it's not me. Another thing I wanted to touch on, I know in a lot of state houses across the country, they've introduced bans on who can play in which sport, a transgender person, if they can play, and if somebody is identifying as female, if they can play in a female sport or a male sport. I think that people should be able to freely play in the sports of the gender that they identify with. Outside of politics, I'm currently training for MMA fighting right now, and it's kind of in the back of my head, like if I decided to get into this professionally, would I have to compete against the guys or would I have to compete against the girls? And to me, it's like, I have to train just as hard as everybody else to get up to that professional level. And I don't see the difference that it makes. Like, I don't see why I have an advantage over a female fighter who I could be competing against. So and that's one of the other things I wanted to touch on today. And I have to always constantly look out for my safety. And even like daily life things, even going out on dates, I have a couple of good friends of mine who I will message them, say, hey, I'm going on a date with this person. I will let you know if I'm home safely and that things went well. And that's just because violence is a big issue in our community. It sucks that it is this way, but I have to be realistic with my approach to things and how I live about my daily life. And this is why when you see a lot of these bills are introduced, even here in Wisconsin, where I live, the state that I love, that I do not want to leave, but you know, it's scary. It really is. Why do I have to have a plan B to move somewhere else? I shouldn't have to have a plan B. I should be able to freely live as who I am here. And I think that's mostly what I wanted to touch on. I'll pass it on to who's next.
Okay. Well, I'm Wendy Strout. I'm the state director in Wisconsin for the Human Rights Campaign, and I use she, her pronouns. HRC, we are the largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization in the country. And we fight for equality on all fronts, not just politically, not just legislatively, but a lot of different ways. But back to legislatively, as Jessica said, it's been a rough year. We thought last year was the worst ever year for LGBTQ plus bills. But no, 2023 has proven to be even worse. We've seen over 500 bills introduced. We've seen at least 75 enacted. Many have been litigated against, but then we're seeing their side sometimes win on some of these lawsuits. But the fact is that these legislative, just being introduced really creates a fear and creates an environment that is scary, that is real, and the threat is very real and very dangerous. So in the HRC in its 40-plus year history has done something unprecedented, is they declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ plus people this year. It is so scary, and just as Jessica was saying, people are trying to figure out where can they actually live, where is safe for them. Whether they're, however they identify, it's dangerous for all people, to go, to move. And so we're seeing these bills, we're seeing this hatred, and we're, even in Wisconsin, we're seeing these bills, we're hearing rumors about bills that are going to be introduced that are basically a page out of the playbook from some states like Florida. Like they just, as you all know, they copy them and take, they're all in the same book. But the fact that, they're talking about, oh, we want to save, girls' sports. We want to save protect parents' rights. Do not let them fool you. Do not let them pull you off. This is real, it's calculated, it's strategically designed to systemically push LGBTQ people plus back in the closet. It's designed to erase LGBTQ plus people. And it is something that they're really making sure that they can quiet their voices. But don't worry, LGBTQ plus people are fighting back. And you're gonna see that a lot in the polls. You'll see that in endorsements that are made by different organizations like ours, like ACLU, like Equality Federation. So there is fighting back. And just to bring it back to Wisconsin, like I said, we are hearing these bills, but they're also, you're hearing a lot about the impeachment of our Supreme Court justice, or anything that they're trying to do to not have fair maps. The fact is that fair maps is also very much an LGBTQ plus issue. Because if you look at Michigan, they have fair maps, and they passed pro-equality legislation in a bipartisan manner. And so if we have fair maps in Wisconsin, we're actually able to have conversations with, across the aisles about how do we make this a more inclusive state? How do we make this a more welcoming state? So when you're thinking about things like redistricting, it definitely is also an equality issue as well. But before I turn it over to Melinda, I wanted just to leave you with a few tips from HRC on how to write and talk about LGBTQ plus people. First of all, know that words matter. A lot of Americans are afraid to talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. But LGBTQ plus people use a variety of terms to describe themselves. And HRC, on our website, hrc.org, we actually have a lot of resources for people. So you can how do you identify people? How do you talk about people? So we have those resources. We also have our communications department. You can email press@hrc.org to ask. What is this, legislation? Am I talking about this right? Is this the right terminology, or can you explain more about this piece of legislation? So we're very open to helping you write about our community. But also talk to diverse voices. Talk to parents of LGBTQ kids. Talk to providers. Talk to transgender people. Talk to Black and Brown communities, especially because they have been a big target of a lot of the hatred, and are especially Black and Brown trans women have been a lot of targets. So talk to a variety of people, but also listen to how people identify themselves. Listen to how people refer to themselves. Talk to family and friends about how does this person identify, especially if you're writing about someone who's been killed or has been passed away. Make sure that you're listening and taking in how people describe themselves and take the lead from them. And then also, if you just another plug is if you just want to get on our list as well, whether it's for your state or for national, again, just email press@hrc.org. But that I will turn it over to Melinda.
Well, first, thank you to both of you. You've done a beautiful job, and so I get to fill in a little bit of the gaps in between things. So just so that you know who you're talking to 3 panelists who are already part of this community and are leading in these spaces. And I think that matters a great deal. And so I'd just like to say thank you for including us. We said this before the panel started, but it matters a great deal when you either are part of a community or you operate in deep allyship across a community and you're being asked to speak. That is hugely important. So Melinda Brennan, she, her pronouns, Executive Director of the ACLU of Wisconsin. Things I want to fill in the gaps with, because so much of the conversation has happened already, and that's wonderful. I want to underscore that the anti-democracy tactics that you're seeing in Wisconsin are very much directly impacting LGBTQ plus folks. And I want to make sure that you understand that the more volatile this political environment is, the less safe people of marginalized backgrounds are going to feel. And that impacts their day-to-day living. That's going to the grocery store, that's how safe they feel at work. It shouldn't have to matter who your boss is, whether or not they're going to respect your pronouns or whether or not you'll have health care. It should not matter. And to be able to be free of those kinds of calculations on a daily basis of can you walk down the street without reasonable fear of something terrible happening to you or somebody else that you care deeply about, on every level that impacts you psychologically. So when there's the mention of over 500 bills in the United States in 2023, that has a direct impact on mental health of everybody who is LGBTQ+, not only in Wisconsin, but nationally. So even if you live in a state where you think we have some pretty good policies and the political environment is much more stable, you are still essentially having a boomerang effect, that it cuts at your mental health. And so even in states where you want to call them blue states or you want to call them democracy forward states or whatever you want to say, they are still receiving the negative impact of the things that happen in states like Wisconsin that is deeply purple. So it is not just that there are incubator states where bad bills come from and then they're imported out very intentionally per playbook and repeated over and over again with progressively worse bills coming out. So it isn't merely that they're incubated in a state and then they travel across state lines. Yes, that's true. But if you watch in legislative cycle over legislative cycle, it is if one can get passed and signed by a governor, then let's take the next step. And so it is procedurally worse at each iteration. And so some of the responsibility in Wisconsin is to not let bad things leave. And I think many other leaders in states who are willing to vocally speak out about this or be part of the fight would tell you the same thing, that there is a level of responsibility that is very, to be frank, painful if you are part of the community, because it is directly impacting you and you are working on those issues at the same time as you're supporting other people in your community who are also directly impacted, at the same time as you do not want these things leaving your state and negatively impacting people you may never meet. And so that is some of the sobering, not only political reality, but the emotional reality of the situation. Another thing that I want to draw together for you is we can talk about sports bills that are bad, and we can talk about healthcare bills that are bad, and I also want to draw your attention to the banning of books and or materials. The endless hunting after public educators who relentlessly support their students in learning who they are and learning about their history and their communities. I will tell you that growing up, I did not have any of those. I didn't have hostility, it was the absence. It wasn't a neutral, it was just an absence. And I can't imagine the difference it would have made in me figuring out who I was and what I was willing to be committed to and fight for the rest of my life if in 4th grade or something, somebody had said, hey, here's this book that you should read. Or here's a GSA. Why don't you go join that and see if you have some productive conversation. And those are real outcomes. And trigger warning, folks, just to take this all the way home, if you do any kind of even surface level research on the impact of the political environment on LGBTQ+ people, you will find out that whatever the political messages are, if you have a supportive community of people in your near circle where you are locally, the chances that those things will immediately and horrifyingly impact your mental health are somewhat mitigated. And if you don't have that support, then just check the suicide rates. That math is exactly that simple. Anyone who says differently is attempting to obfuscate it and manipulate you instead. And so imagine the impact of having educators being able to be the one that just uses the right pronouns, uses your name. Little things that endlessly affirm you. Tells you that it's okay to be queer, that that's normal. That's the difference between a young person making it to adulthood or not. And so when you attack public educators at every single level, and not just K-12, but in college, because imagine people come from all kinds of different backgrounds. Maybe they go to a state school, and so if you are cutting at critical race theory, or you're anti-LGBT, or you refuse women and gender studies, or any of those things, or those fields, if you refuse that and you yank it out of libraries and you shut down those centers and you close those programs, where are those young people going to go? And so when I say that this is anti-democracy, I don't mean it as trying to thinly tie things together. I mean it's a very direct impact. Because who are the voters? When you look at Gen Z and essentially what their political bent is towards this particular conglomeration of humans who is LGBTQ, it's very clear that they are not interested in going backwards. But the more that they're actively disempowered and the generation after them are actively disempowered by not having local people to support them, by having books pulled off the shelves, and just by a culture of fear where educators are waiting for the next bad bill to come to their state, where they might be prosecuted for calling somebody by the right name or telling them that they deserve to be alive, even in a state where these bills aren't active. What does that communicate to educators all across the country? And so I just want to thank you for the kind of work and engagement that you're doing right now, to have all the conversations that you need to go and get fantastic resources, to listen to directly impacted people, to think through how all of these things are actually quite tightly knit together, and that only through someone who's trying to be a magician and separate these issues would they be cleanly separated. And the reality is the anti-democratic tactics that we're facing in Wisconsin are happening in other states, and we unfortunately, as a purple state in significant volatility right now, are an incubator. And so when you reach out to people in the states that you're from, if you're from a state that could be called red or purple, I implore you to just have a moment before you engage and think, what's the emotional load that the person is carrying? You don't have to get all of it, but just have a moment of pause to be like, okay, the reality is, if this is a person from the community who's doing this work, there's already an emotional load. And then if they're from a political environment that's really tough, that they're living in as a person and a leader trying to do this work, that's another load. And so if you can just take a moment of pause before you begin that conversation, then maybe you will have the wonderful kind of context that Jessica did and those robust relationships. Because if you take the time to do that, I'm certain that the respect will flow both ways.
Well, thank you very much. There go the hands.
Okay.
I told you this wasn't going to be popular, right?
Hey, thank you so much for being here. I'm William Elhato from the Texas Tribune. When I was reporting on particularly gender-affirming care for trans youth, I think one of the things that I struggled with was just the waves of misinformation that were coming, and trying to kind of fact-check things, but in when legislators are having debate, they don't really actually have to be telling the truth. And so I guess any guidance that you can give on that, and how to basically frame it in the best way.
HRC, we do a lot of education about gender-affirming care because there's a lot of misinformation. And for youth, gender-affirming care, and it's not necessarily medical. It's just calling them the right pronouns, like Melinda said, and it's letting them dressing the way they want, how they feel, whether it's wearing a dress or wearing pants or whatever. It's nothing is medical until they can make their own decisions. Unless it's there's nothing medical until they're an adult and can make their own decisions. But it's all about just how they present. It could be puberty blockers as well. But again, those are reversible. Nothing is irreversible for minors. But yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there. But I can imagine in Texas, because HRC was down there a lot fighting in Texas, there's a lot of lies and a lot of misinformation, especially about gender-affirming care in youth.
I can speak on a little bit on my personal experience of transitioning too. So I'm 44 years old. It's almost 10 years of living as who I am now. I could tell that there was something different about me as early as 8 years old. Now, granted, I grew up in the 1980s when these type of topics were not widely accepted or talked about as they are today. And I didn't really grow up in a family that was really accepting of those type of topics. Or else I think maybe I could have transitioned sooner than age 35. I'm glad I did when I did, because it was the best, probably the best decision I've ever made in my life. But if I could have done it sooner, would I have done it? Sure, of course.
Hi all, thanks for being here. I'm Samantha from the Boston Globe. I use she, her pronouns. I I was on Instagram last night and I got a Visit Massachusetts ad saying, everyone's welcome here. I covered that when that came out. They're spending like almost $1 million on these ads in red states, or states that have bills that are unfriendly. And I'm wondering what you guys make of that kind of approach of maybe like using stuff that's happening in other states to draw people to states like Massachusetts, where there are like a lot of protections and laws for the LGBTQ community.
Can I take this
Yeah,
one?
Go for it.
please.
Okay. So, it's my understanding that your next session is on redistricting. So let me tell you where the end point is going to be while I address this conversation. When the impeachment talk went live, really, truly, it seemed imminent in its progress forward. And Megan Wolf, as a very competent human in her job, was threatened and then removed. At the same time as a redistricting bill as an end run around the state Supreme Court is happening, that trifecta of things, which is very obviously tied in time and part of a playbook, I had a conversation with a colleague, couple of colleagues, all of them in finance. And I said, tell me from your perspective why this is a terrible problem. And we agree politically, and so you can kind of begin in the middle of the conversation. I said, tell me the disaster scenario from your perspective. And immediately they said, if this happens, the credit rating of the state of Wisconsin will go down the tubes. See the history of Illinois. So when Wisconsin is well known as a place that has a problem with brain drain and young people leave all the time for greener pastures or maybe rainbow ones elsewhere, it's a bad idea to continue to destabilize democracy and also to fight against the exact youth that you would like to keep in the state, even if they themselves are not directly impacted. So if you want to talk about backwards thinking, that is not future thinking about which Wisconsinites anyone is answering to, you're just giving an opportunity to other states. Instead, to capture the interest of people and say, oh, but I'd be more safe on the streets there. Whether that's true or not, and violence can happen anywhere, and we know this. But the reality is, it's a captivating narrative. Well, things are dumpster fire of democracy here. This is a troubling time in Wisconsin. I'm a young person and I'm deciding how I want to build my future. You know what? I don't have so much to lose right now. Why don't I move to a blue state that is telling me that I will physically and mentally be safer because there are protections at the state level? That's a hard narrative to fight against. And only people who are thinking of the moment for power grabs would choose otherwise.
Hi, I'm Blair Miller with the Daily Montanan, he, him pronouns. So this session, we were very much, had pretty much everything you talked about all session long. And I think something you said about sort of the emotional and mental aspect of it, if you're in the LGBTQ community, and seeing this onslaught of bills, it was kind of a pain because we had to cover so much of it to show what was going on. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on, between the bills and like what happened with Zoe Zephyr, just kind of how you can, tailor your coverage so it doesn't hurt the community while also shining light on what's happening, I guess.
That's a rough paradox, but I think, Jessica, do you want to take this first?
Sure. What happened to her, it kind of makes me wonder if I had won my race. I lost my race by just 6 points, which is, in the terms of electoral politics, a very slim, narrow margin. And that was hard for me to take, as somebody who had to go through all that emotion, and it's like, I just had to take a break for a while. And it makes me wonder if I had got elected, if I would have had to put up with the same thing here. Or how would they have treated me here? Although I know I had to do what I had to do because I did it and my voice was out there. People had conversations about me. My constituents, they had conversations about me, whether it was good or bad. And that's the type of thing that we need to keep progressing forward. And yes, I've talked about okay, do I have to have a plan B to move to another state if it comes to the point where I do not feel safe here? Yeah, I do. But I also know I am needed right here because this is the front lines of battle that we're continuously fighting every single day. And honestly, it's exhausting. It's like you feel like you go through one fight and then another and then another.
You know, we had so many people come to committee hearings, parents of trans kids. Lots of trans kids came in themselves and talked and said, hey, we're watching what you guys are saying in all these committee hearings with all these bills, and we don't feel safe, we want to leave, we're scared, all of that. And so as journalists, you know, I think we feel a duty to shine a light on what's happening with the bills, with the legislation, why that's happening, also speaking with the community a lot. But you know, whenever you're seeing story after story after story every day about the attacks on the community, I mean, is there anything you can do to mitigate that as reporters for the public, I guess, like to mitigate the harm?
I think that's hard to do, but I think telling the stories of those affected
Yes.
is a great way to get the issue out there and also combat the misinformation that comes from the legislative body that puts out that is putting out these bills. So I think telling the stories of those who are affected is a great way to mitigate that.
Completely agree. If you can always center the people that are directly impacted, do so in their own words. That is where the power is, and you fill in all the gaps of all of the things that you know that are happening, and they're not responsible for all the factual pieces of it. But if there was a question that I would want tagged onto the back of an interview that you would never sacrifice, whether it makes it in or not, or maybe it's part of a larger story, is asking people what makes them resilient. Because there has to be hope in there as well.
That's a great point.
It can't just be we're endlessly fighting against these things and we're terrified. And that's true, and that should be reported because that's honest. And also, so then why do you show up again and do it again?
And sometimes I feel like some of these bills have been introduced here. I've shown up before for the committee hearings to testify against them. And I've seen numerous people, from the community, the allies, to the point where they've had overflow rooms at the Capitol. And I feel like many times we will express our voice, but these lawmakers, they seem like they don't care to listen to us. Yeah, they're just going to continue to introduce these. And that's why a lot of times I think that for them, it's all about just keeping their power and their control of what they have here in Wisconsin, amongst other states too.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Haley, she, her pronouns. I work for the USA Today Network in Ohio, another state not particularly great on this front. Kind of an addendum to what Blair was talking about. I think we have a lot of conversations at the local level in Columbus about crime coverage and, getting in different neighborhoods, not just when the bad stuff happens, but when the good things are happening too. And I'm wondering how you feel like that would help coverage of LGBTQ issues, if there were political government stories sort of celebrating the community and not just, writing about, this transgender bill was introduced today. How do you feel like that would help the conversation?
Go ahead.
I think that celebrating that, to have that approach is good, because we do need to celebrate the good things that are happening within our community. But it's also still important to have those conversations that we need to about these bills being introduced, because that information does need to get out to our community so that people can make informed decisions when they're going out there and voting, or if it's things just like talking to our lawmakers to hopefully try to not get these things introduced or not get them passed.
And I don't know if they, so in Wisconsin, we, our LGBTQ caucus every year introduces an equality agenda. I never know how much press it gets because, they're in the minority. But even just highlighting and looking for those stories of positive bills being introduced, or even celebrating local governments. HRC, we talk about, we rate local governments on a municipal equality index, and even highlighting Columbus got an, whatever score, and kind of focusing on those and even talking to the local officials, why that was important to them.
I have one more addition, and it's a strange one. In a previous life, I was a social scientist, and I will tell you that, and you know this, that representation matters, but it matters on this kind of level. The greater your positive exposure not even necessarily knowing one person, although that helps a great deal, and there are metrics on this, and the research is not difficult to find. But having positive representations of people who are in marginalized communities or identities does an incredible job of essentially in advance battling back a hateful response. Because if you've already been confronted with the idea that these are humans too, and their fundamental humanity is not ever to be questioned under any circumstances, if that's where you're starting from, it is much more difficult to get traction on a bad bill. It seems even more out there of like, what are you doing? Because we have all these events, and this is how the community collects, and this is how many people showed up, and here's what the index says, and here's how various local institutions are rated, and here's how welcoming they are, and here's the state level LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce. All of that matters because A, the community is not invisibilized, and B, you're starting from a place of here are all these positive outcomes that not only show the visibility, but people being together and doing good work. And so then if that's the backdrop of the conversation of bad bills, that's a different conversation.
Hi, I'm Lynn from Cal Matters in California. So California is seen as a really progressive state on this stuff, but we actually have some bills in line that are pretty harmful. One question that I wanted to ask is that the whole both sidesism, it's like obviously one side who doesn't want to recognize the humanity of a group, it's like obviously not equal, but whenever we write about like trans kids bills, I get a lot of emails about Chloe Cole, who was like, she's from San Francisco. She goes up and down the state. If you don't know her, she's like a teenager who detransitioned. She talks a lot. And there are people who are like, well, why don't you interview her? Why aren't you like saying this side? So can I get some of the thoughts on that stuff? Because this, is like a person who at one point was in the community and is now like advocating against this community. And it's like, and people are saying, why don't you feature her voice? And if you truly want to be, unbiased. So can I have some, like just your thoughts on that?
Chloe, there's like so few of those people, and we don't even address that. Like, I think the more you speak to people who have transitioned and get their stories and tell their stories, those are the stories you want to highlight. And I get the pushback, and but I don't know if it's necessarily balanced either. And I get the dilemma that you all are in. It's like, you want to hear, you're trying to give a fair and balanced approach. But also there's a thing about, just also writing about the truth as well. So I think even the more people that you talk to who have successfully transitioned, which is the majority of transgender people, I think just continue to emphasize those stories. So, but I definitely understand the dilemma you're in and where that comes from. But there's a lot more people that have been successful and are happy and much happier, and telling their stories is crucially important.
Hi all, I'm Jack Kelly from Wisconsin Watch. I'm actually the only Wisconsin-based reporter. I'm curious, so obviously we've seen the so-called Save Women's Sports Act be introduced here in Wisconsin. The speaker has hinted that there would be a legislation forthcoming to ban gender-affirming care for trans kids. Those things happen not very often in Wisconsin. I think it's only 400 kids here that receive that kind of care. I think there was one high school athlete last year that this would have applied to. What do you see the motivations for Republicans to pursue these things for, given that Evers has said he will veto them? I mean, he told me that. Personally, what do you see the motivation for Republican lawmakers to pursue these things when, some might say the writing's on the wall for them, new legislative maps could be threatened to lose their majorities? What's the incentive to do this when these things aren't that popular?
Well, motivation, it seems like children are constantly being gaslit with these. It's like they're continually attacking children. They feel like, don't know really the particular reasons why. And the fact that those numbers that you mentioned as well too, makes me wonder too, these people who introduce these bills, have they ever actually even talked to somebody in their district of who that would affect, whether it's positively or negatively? And the answer to that is probably no. They're just introducing them just to pass their agenda through the Statehouse like they're doing all across the country. And I think that that is what their motivation is. I don't know why they're continually to attack our community, or whether it's just distract from the greater issue that's going on. So that's kind of just my initial thoughts on it.
I mean, it's very calculated. You know, it's part of this national agenda that is to erase LGBTQ plus people. And you're right. I mean, it's not about any of the bills that they're introducing. It's about spreading this erasure of LGBTQ plus people. And it's about, you can also say it's about distracting from what they're really trying to do. But it's just a very strategic and calculated agenda against LGBTQ plus people and trying to move this other agenda, but it's very strategic and very calculated nationally. That's why you see all the same bills that they're popping up. And so it's just, and even though Governor Evers will veto it, he's committed to the LGBT, he's one of our most pro-equality governors, it's very much not even about that. They just they're trying to push their own agenda and push the message out there of erasing LGBTQ plus people.
And to piggyback on that, that's why one of the things I'll say, I feel like every day it's like I'm constantly fighting just for my own existence, just to exist as who I am.
I mean, I don't think it's a secret. It was a grift. If you were an election denier, it was a great way to raise money. Do you see that there's some element of that to this?
Yes.
Big national element. You latch onto it. You can fundraise on the fact that you wanted to save women's sports, whatever it might be. Is that it falls in the same vein? You think?
Yes. Culture wars raise money, and the people that are on the margins are easy targets. And fundamentally, at a base level about organizing. And I'll back up to the political question. It is optional to be an ally. It is optional to be truthful, to rely on, to a previous question, science and facts, to say that overwhelmingly trans people who decide to transition are in control of their bodies and identities are healthier, and we're grateful that they're with us and alive. It's optional to be an ally. It's optional to refuse homophobia. It's optional to refuse transphobia. It's optional. And so anyone who isn't a member of the community can just not pay attention. And so the only people that can't opt out are the ones that are directly impacted. So what you have is an intense group of committed people who are directly impacted, and this is true for every single marginalized community, although it's different depending on who they are. And then you have their devoted allies who care politically, maybe personally, because these are people that they love in their lives and they came to the issue in some kind of way. And so what is the calculation to say, you know what, we know that this is unpopular in at least 2 of the youngest generations, really 3. We're going to lose in terms of time. I'm going to opt into a failing strategy. It is temporary fundraising. Because, unfortunately, money is politics. And it doesn't square with where we are generationally in terms of our politics. It doesn't square with science. It doesn't square with people speaking out who are from the community. It doesn't. You can't make it make sense. But it will fundraise. And it will make people feel, it gives the opportunity to say, people from this community are radical and they're on the outside, right? And these are Darvo tactics, where you accuse the other people of exactly what you're doing. And it's easy and it works if nobody's paying attention.
Thank you. I'm working on some reporting on this, so would love to connect afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. Sonia, she, her pronouns. I'm with Time. I wanted to bring up this issue I've been seeing, particularly in Michigan and Maryland. There's been a big push for parents to push for opt-out classes for younger students when it comes to content regarding LGBTQ issues. And one thing in particular that's caught my eye. I myself am Muslim and have seen this issue blowing up, where it's not just far-right evangelicals, but there's also a strange, odd bedfellows alliance here of many Muslim parents, as well as far-right evangelicals, and it's definitely created a rupture within the Muslim community. But I'm curious, is there any unique challenge you face when there is another sort of minority group involved here, and A, I mean, are you seeing this kind of thing in Wisconsin at all? I don't know if there's a big enough community here, but B, like, what happens when are you seeing like different kinds of groups or opponents like pushing these kinds of bills, particularly like of different religious faiths, and how might that pose like unique challenges to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so that is actually a great question. In Wisconsin, we see, we work closely with an organization called GSAFE, and they've been monitoring school boards across the state. And let me back up. So this, pulling, these parents like feeling very fearful. I mean, that's also part of the calculation, is to create fear and division in other people. So that's part of like this, creating this fear with parents. But there's a lot of that going on in Wisconsin in our school boards across the state. And in HRC is part of a larger national coalition of organizations, like with Equality Fed, NAACP, NEA, a lot of other organizations. And we're actually in Wisconsin and 4 other states, we're kicking off a Parents Week of Action next week. And in Wisconsin, we're doing a daily toolkit for parents so they can advocate for their rights, and so they can advocate for their kids and the schools. And so that's like how we're approaching it, is really giving parents the tools so that they can advocate for inclusive schools and defend the teachers, and and ask their administrators to kind of fight back from some of this stuff that you're seeing in other states. I don't know if you want.
I just say that I'm aware. I did some of this research in my previous life. If I'm having a one-on-one conversation, or if I'm having a conversation with a small group of folks where it's intimate and you can actually talk, the conversation is different, because I will ask them, are the rest of the people that you're agreeing with ever going to support you? And so the question is, how did you arrive there? And sometimes there are divisions between marginalized groups, and that's a reality. But in this political environment, in general, it's often a manipulation. Mm-hmm. And so the question has to be asked, because I just assume everyone's intelligent. And so who has been talking to you and why? And did they make you any promises? And do you believe if you were the one that was targeted, or was your family, or was your mosque, would they show up for you or no? And just be thoughtful about what that means. And then people will make the decisions that they do. But we're always stronger together when we're willing to unite across difference, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Hello, Alex Degman, WBEZ in Chicago. It's kind of a two-part question, but broadly, is there anything that you wish out LGBTQ journalists at mainstream outlets would do better or more of? Is there an inherent responsibility for LGBTQ journalists to not necessarily advocate, but tell stories in a certain way? And then narrowing it down a little bit, if there are LGBTQ journalists that have certain privileges, like white, masculine, can blend into pretty much any situation, are there certain responsibilities that we have in telling those stories and making sure that they're accurate?
Sure. I could take some of it. I always appreciated it when people got the time to get to know who I was when I was a candidate. They asked me the questions about what it was like to be who I am too, to get that real story out there, and made me feel comfortable doing the interview with the media outlets in the Milwaukee area that I did interviews with. There really wasn't any interviews that made me feel comfortable, except I remember there was a couple of years ago, I ran for state assembly in 2020. Spectrum News did an interview on me, and I remember the camera guy kept pointing the camera right on my breasts throughout most of the interview, and I'm sitting there thinking, this is interesting. It kind of made me feel a little uncomfortable watching that. So just kind of, that positivity that we've been talking about too is always a good thing, if it's a positive story, and to make sure that it's truthful and factual.
And I just think to add to that, making sure that your colleagues are also, like, you're kind of making sure that they understand how to talk about our community, and making sure that they are not misrepresenting and that they're telling the actual truth. Because I think, and just even, telling the stories and making sure that, and coming at it from, like, what would you want to be told about our community? Like, what would you want to share? So I think, in terms of that, I think that would be a way to just be an advocate in a way that you can, as limited by your work.
I have a different answer, which is I expect allies to show up. And so if you're not directly impacted, that's your job, period, for every single different kind of community. And so I would ask everyone who is not directly impacted by any kind of story, bill, or whatever it is that we're talking about, do the work, do your homework. Figure out who the relative people are to ask the questions, right? Go to the HRC, go to local educators who have done the work, and get yourself educated. But for people who are of the community, I think the work is, if you are relatively privileged amongst the people that are in press and of the community, then if somebody's got to say the thing, then yeah. It's always the person who has more relative privilege in the community. If somebody's got to say it and it's not being said, then it's you. Mm-hmm. It's you. Because don't ask somebody who is multiply marginalized and has other things cutting against them, and it makes it more painful to say it, and or it makes it more risky to say it. Don't make them say it. So yes. And so the answer is, if there aren't allies showing up, then yes, and probably in the background, because why should you have to do so much work?
Can you hear me? There we go. Claire Hendrickson, Detroit Free Press, she, her pronouns. Michigan lawmakers this session have codified LGBTQ protections in the state civil rights law, banned conversion therapy. Wondering what else you would add to a list in your ideal world if they were to pass more protections for the LGBTQ community, and other states you see as sort of models on that front that Michigan could be looking to. Thanks.
I mean, there's always stuff you can pass. You can look into passing. Like, for example, when I transitioned and I went through like my legal name change, if you're born in the state of Wisconsin, you cannot legally change the gender marker on your birth certificate. I was originally born in Maryland, so I was able to get that gender marker changed. And I know, like, even something, it seems so little, but it means so much to somebody. It's so affirming to somebody to see that, say, female or male or whatever you identify as. Granted, here in Wisconsin, going through the name change and having to change all my IDs and all my other documents and stuff was fairly easy. I mean, it's kind of, you kind of have this like long laundry list of things you got to do. Like, I was able to get that gender marker changed in my driver's license. Because imagine, like, okay, transitioning male to female, walk into a bar, you're asked to see your ID, and it says male on there. How uncomfortable would that make me feel as a transgender female? And then they look at that, they think that that's not you, and you get kicked out or whatever. Or even like opening up an account at a bank. Like, just being able to be affirmed of who I am at little daily things that we all do. Even using the bathroom. That was one of the things that I had to get over with when I first started transitioning. It's getting comfortable using the women's bathroom. No cisgender person ever has to think twice about what bathroom they use. But when you're talking to a transgender person, it seems like it's always in the back of my mind. Why are they attacking? Like, why are they trying to say what bathroom I can't use? It's like, what are they going to do? Have the bathroom police that's standing in front of each public bathroom door and say, hey, we need to check your gender before you're coming in here. We have to poop and pee just like everybody else.
I would just add to that history and social movements. Everybody's history should be told. And that as a critical lack in public education that is endlessly being fought over. And not just for LGBTQ plus folks, but yes, our histories as well.
Hi there, Monica Harkins. I'm WDRB in Louisville, Kentucky. We have a lot going on, but that's not really the point of my question. My question is, I was faced in a social setting that I think I had never been in before, of someone blatantly denying that transgender people exist. And I was very uncomfortable with that, in the sense of I didn't know how to say, you are wrong, they do exist, and in a way that they would hear me. So is there any way you would say this, and it's not necessarily in reporting that I faced it, but I feel like with this being such a hot topic in Kentucky's everything, that it's not going to be the last time that I face that, and how would you go about saying that? And maybe that's part of the battle that continues, but just advice for the room.
I mean, I am willing to go, if you want me to drive down 8 hours to Louisville to Kentucky.
How generous.
Hey, look, we exist. I mean, it's also too, the comfortability that people have in our community talking about these things. I know myself, I'm a very open person. When I came out, I made that commitment to be open about myself, because I always believed education, activism, as the type of activist I am, is good, because ignorance is why a lot of these things that you're seeing happening across the country is out of ignorance. I'd rather have somebody ask me about things to learn about what it's like to be me, what it's like to transition. And I know that everybody in our communities is as open as I am, and not everybody in our community has the same story as I do, or has the same privilege as I do. I know that, having been a state senate candidate, I have this sort of platform, and I take that responsibility very seriously. And I think that just having that careful approach, talking to people within the community, and it's just constantly reaffirming that they exist, that they belong here, and just showing love to each other goes a long way. A little bit of love, because you don't know what's going on in their lives. Many times when people come out as trans or LGBTQ, whatever it might be, they're disowned by their own families. And it's very sad. And it's part of the things that we have to deal with. So,
in a past life, I was an educator, and I'm the person that wants to get everybody in the room. Can't we get together on something? Can't we have a shared experience on something? That's what my goal is in every conversation. And so when someone would deny that trans people or non-binary people existed, I'd ask, so how'd you come to believe that? Because the responsibility is on the person who believes something that is not factual to explain where it came from. And if there's going to be any empathy that you can provide, and sometimes, depending on who you are, it's in short supply, because a lot of us who are multiply marginalized take a lot of hits, and allies who do the work are also very tired as well. But if you can, if they have a real answer for it, and there's a source, and it is incredible, say, would you be open if I was able to connect you to somebody who is an educator? And if they're not, they're not. And sometimes it's about people believing that the way that they view the world is correct, and that anti-transness stands in for one of those ways, that the way I view the world is correct. And so science and medicine and actual trans people's lived experience doesn't matter at all. So the question is, are they open to having conversation? And if not, your time is used better taking care of yourself and other people. It is.
We have time for one more, and I think, Randy, did you have? You're good? Okay. Anybody else? Right here? You sure?
No, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because I'm trying to get educated myself.
Go ahead.
I'm Randy from West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I'm sorry. When you talked about changing your birth certificate, is that truthful and factual that you would change when you were born your, the way you want to identify yourself? Did you know you were there then? Do you understand my question?
Did I know I was?
Yeah, I mean, you said you at 35 is when and I'm just wondering, were you? How do you know what you were when you were born? So you're changing your birth certificate. Is that you all said to be truthful and factual? And so, if somebody comes up to me with this argument, is that truthful and factual to know that you were male or female on the other side when you were born?
I knew I was different something was different about me when I was 8, as soon as I was 8 years old.
So you
Yeah.
can infer that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just didn't know what that was because I wasn't brought up in that environment that was healthy enough to explore the possibility that I was trans. And keep in mind, this is way back in the 1980s when these topics were not, really widely talked about as they are today or as accepted as they are today. And just by changing my birth certificate and that I was able to do that, I'm really grateful that I was able to change that gender marker because I read it, I'm like, yeah, this is pretty cool. It says female on here, so that's why, to me, it's very reaffirming. And I know, unfortunately, many transgender people here in Wisconsin are not able to do that because they were born here. And that's something that we need to change here.
Well, I also just want to add another layer to that is that you need a birth certificate to get so many of your documents that you use every day.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, when you're writing about it, like, if people argue with that, it's like, not only did she know what she, who she really was when she was younger, but you need to change that because it leads to so much of the rest of your documents. Yeah.
Right, because like if I'm opening up, say, like a bank account or something like that, right? I walk into a bank and then I'm dressed as how I identify as female, and my documents say male. That makes me feel uncomfortable. And then, just having those questions asked by a banker, why does this say male? Yeah, it shouldn't really matter at the end of the day, right? That's how I feel.
Right.
No, you should be respected all the time, everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I hate my job as a timekeeper. But we do need to wrap up. And I also want to extend my thanks again to all three of you for a great session. Thank you.